Georgia, 2007. A young woman vanishes without a trace and the case goes cold for over 15 years. Her name was Kaylen Marie Hartsfield, a 20-year-old veterinary assistant, known in her small Georgia town for her tender heart and deep love of animals. One evening, she left work and never made it home. Her car was later found abandoned by a wooded roadside, keys still in the ignition. Despite urgent searches and local outrage, the case was plagued by dead ends and years of silence. No suspects. No closure, but in a twist no one saw coming. A DNA match cracked the case wide open, and the arrest stunned the entire community. Before we begin, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. Nestled just outside the quiet city of Macon, Georgia, was a place where everyone still left their doors unlocked, where neighbors waved from porches and kids played in cul-de-sacs without fear. It was a town that seemed immune to the darker stories that plagued big cities. And within this town lived a young woman whose heart was even softer than the southern soil she called home. Kaylen Marie Hartsfield was 20 years old in the spring of 2007. She wasn't a headline. She wasn't famous. She was better, known to those who mattered most. She was the girl who stayed late at the veterinary clinic to comfort anxious pets and cleaned kennels without complaint. Animals loved her instinctively, and so did people. She was a calming presence, someone who never asked for attention but somehow lit up every room she entered. Her work as a veterinary assistant at Greenfield Animal Clinic wasn't glamorous, but she approached it with a devotion well beyond her years. Coworkers described her as gentle but fierce when she needed to be, especially when it came to the care of an injured stray or a frightened dog trembling on the exam table. For Kaylen, this wasn't just a job. It was a stepping stone. She was saving for vet school, planning to transfer to a program in Atlanta. The dream was clear. The path was set. She lived with her parents, Robert and Linda Hartsfield, in a modest ranch-style home not far from her work. The Hartsfields were longtime residents, a pillar family in the area. Robert worked as a middle school science teacher. Linda, a part-time librarian, spent most of her time supporting Kaylen's aspirations. Together, they had raised their only child with kindness, structure, and love. Weekends for Kaylen were spent volunteering at the Macon Animal Shelter or helping Linda plant vegetables in their backyard garden. She loved poetry, old acoustic albums, and classic veterinary textbooks she borrowed from the local college. Her friends remembered how she never raised her voice, how she was always the one to offer a ride, a listening ear, or a comforting word. There was no drama in her life. No enemies, no signs of fear or discomfort. Everything about Kaylen suggested stability, purpose, and peace, which is why her story still sends a chill down the spine of anyone who hears it. On the outside, nothing seemed amiss. She didn't have a troubled past. She wasn't living on the edge. She wasn't the kind of person who made enemies or took dangerous risks. Her world was small, safe, and full of people who adored her. There were no secrets, no shadows. Until one day there was. The town that had always felt so secure was about to be shaken by an event no one could have imagined. Because within days, Kaylen would disappear, without warning, without explanation, and without a trace. A routine evening would spiral into years of unanswered questions, grief, and eventually, justice. But in 2007, none of that had happened yet. There was just Kaylen, alive, smiling, driving home from work, like she always did. So how did a young woman with no known enemies, no signs of trouble, and no reason to run simply vanish from the middle of her ordinary life? That haunting question would echo for years in every corner of her small town. It was a humid Thursday evening in April 2007 when Kaylen Marie Hartsfield wrapped up her shift at the Greenfield Animal Clinic. The day had been unremarkable. Routine checkups, a few vaccinations, and one particularly stubborn Labrador who refused to step on the scale. Kaylen had smiled her way through it all as usual. She clocked out at 5:57 p.m., waved goodbye to the receptionist, and stepped out into the golden Georgia dusk. Before pulling out of the parking lot, she texted her mom, "Leaving now. Be home soon. What's for dinner?" It would be the last message she ever sent. When 8 p.m. rolled around and there was still no sign of Kaylen, Linda Hartsfield felt the first pang of unease. She told herself not to panic. Maybe Kaylen had stopped for groceries. Maybe she'd run into a friend. But by 9 p.m., unease gave way to dread. Kaylen's phone rang 3 times before going straight to voicemail. That had never happened before. Linda called Robert, who was out of town for a teachers' conference. He urged her to stay calm, but the tightness in his voice betrayed his own fear. Together they called friends, co-workers, and neighbors. No one had seen or heard from Kaylen. At 9:41 p.m., Linda drove to the sheriff's office and filed a missing persons report. From that moment, the town changed. Within hours, a small army of volunteers, friends, classmates, church members began combing the streets. Flashlights scanned ditches and ravines. Cars slowly rolled through parking lots and abandoned properties. The search extended well past midnight. Every mile between the clinic and her house was traced and retraced, and then, just after sunrise, a sheriff's deputy spotted something while patrolling the old Crescent Hollow Road, a winding, lightly traveled stretch on the outskirts of town. It was Kaylen's blue 2003 Honda Civic, parked at an odd angle just off the shoulder, partially obscured by brush. The driver's door was slightly open. Her purse sat on the passenger seat untouched. The keys were still in the ignition. There were no drag marks, no footprint, no broken glass, no signs of a struggle. The car was unlocked. There was a faint smell of lavender, her usual air freshener, but otherwise, the scene was chilling in its stillness. It was as if she had simply stepped out of her car and vanished into the woods. Investigators swarmed the area. Search dogs were brought in but quickly lost any scent beyond the immediate perimeter. Helicopters were called in for aerial sweeps. The Hartsfields arrived on scene, Linda sobbing as officers taped off the area. Still no sign of Kaylen. People clung to theories. Maybe she had car trouble and walked to find help. Maybe she'd been abducted by someone posing as a good Samaritan. Some wondered if it had been someone she knew, someone she trusted enough to stop the car for. But those were only guesses. What haunted investigators most was how clean the scene looked. It was too perfect, too quiet. If something sinister had happened, it had been carried out with chilling precision. Over the next 48 hours, the search intensified. Dozens of volunteers were organized into grid teams walking through woods, thickets, and creeks. Officers scoured camera footage, gas station logs, and phone towers. The FBI was even briefly consulted. But there was still no Kaylen. The community that once felt like a bubble of safety now found itself grappling with fear, confusion, and a grim realization. What if the answer to Kaylen's disappearance was waiting just beyond the tree line, hidden in silence? 4 days after Kaylen's car was found, the early morning sun cast long shadows across the forest surrounding Crescent Hollow Road. Dozens of searchers moved methodically, eyes scanning the brush, feet crunching over fallen leaves. Among them were local firefighters, church volunteers, and even high school students who had known Kaylen since kindergarten. No one wanted to go home until they had answers. Just before noon, a small search party made up of 3 volunteers veered slightly off the pre-planned grid. They pushed deeper into an area of tangled undergrowth just half a mile from where Kaylen's Civic had been discovered. It was the kind of place most people wouldn't think to look, steep, thick with brambles, and out of view from the road. That's when they saw it, a patch of freshly disturbed earth. Not large, not obvious, but suspicious. One of the volunteers used a stick to probe the ground, and within minutes, they were on the radio calling the sheriff's office. By the time authorities arrived, the area had been cordoned off and declared a potential crime scene. Investigators and a forensic team carefully began to dig, inch by inch, until they uncovered the grim truth. It was Kaylen, still dressed in her light blue veterinary scrubs. Her body was curled in a fetal position, partially wrapped in a thin plastic tarp. Her hand showed signs of defensive wounds, her fingernails broken. The coroner's report would later confirm she had been strangled, likely with a cord or rope. There were no signs of sexual assault, no ligature left behind. Her watch was still on, a delicate silver band her father had given her for her birthday. It had stopped ticking at 6:42 p.m., perhaps the moment her heart did too. What baffled investigators was the sterility of the scene. There were no tire tracks, no discarded items, no cigarette butts, no fibers. Nothing. Whoever had done this had cleaned up after themselves, or knew exactly how to avoid leaving a trace. Crime scene techs swept the area for hours. They sifted soil, clipped branches, and documented every inch. But the result was the same. No DNA, no fingerprints, no hair or fibers. Not even a shoe print. To law enforcement, it felt almost surgical. Someone had taken time. Someone had planned this. Back in town, news of the discovery spread fast. The sheriff's department held a press conference the following morning, confirming that the body found in the woods was Kaylen Hartsfield. A photo of her smiling beside a tabby cat was projected behind the podium as the sheriff read from a prepared statement, voice heavy with emotion. This was a targeted act. We believe Kaylen knew her attacker. The Hartsfield family, already shattered by her disappearance, was now thrust into a deeper kind of grief. The hope that she might walk through the front door, dazed but alive, was gone. The community fell into collective mourning. Ribbons lined Main Street. Candles burned in windows. But along with the grief came a deeper, colder feeling. Fear. If Kaylen had been taken and murdered in such a quiet, calculated way, by someone who left no trace, who else was capable of something like this? And more importantly, was that person still among them? The woods had kept their secret. But for how long would the killer remain hidden in plain sight? With Kaylen's body recovered and the town in mourning, the Bibb County Sheriff's Department escalated the investigation to a full-scale homicide case. The woods had offered no clues, no weapon, no DNA, no personal belongings of the killer. The only thing they had was the body, the abandoned car, and a grieving family desperate for answers. In the first 2 weeks alone, more than 80 tips poured into the sheriff's tip line. Many came from well-meaning locals who thought they had seen something suspicious in the days surrounding Kaylen's disappearance. A man loitering near the animal clinic. A pickup truck parked on Crescent Hollow Road at odd hours. A strange noise heard in the woods. Most turned out to be dead ends. Investigators started close to home, following the logical path. People in Kaylen's orbit. Her ex-boyfriend, Jordan Blake, was brought in for questioning. The two had broken up nearly a year prior, but rumors of lingering bitterness were enough to draw suspicion. He denied any involvement and had an airtight alibi. He was in Atlanta attending a concert the night Kaylen vanished. His ticket stubs, receipts, and phone GPS confirmed it. Next came a male co-worker from the veterinary clinic, someone Kaylen had reportedly argued with weeks before. But according to interviews, the dispute had been minor, something about shift coverage. He passed a polygraph test and had been working late at a second job that evening. Then there was the neighbor, a 50-something man who lived down the street from the Hartsfields. He had a history of making Kaylen uncomfortable, once asking her out despite the age gap, another time showing up uninvited at the clinic with no pet in tow. When confronted, he appeared cooperative, but his behavior raised eyebrows. Still, no physical evidence tied him to the crime. Frustration grew. Detectives pored over Kaylen's phone records, text messages, and voicemails. They dug through her journals, hoping for clues. She'd written about wanting to leave town for vet school, about stress at work, about being tired lately, but nothing that pointed to a threat or a person of interest. Clinic schedules were analyzed to see who might have known her routine. They looked at delivery logs, customer lists, appointment books. Everything came up empty. In the absence of hard evidence, rumors took root. Some believed a drifter had passed through town and attacked her randomly. Others insisted it had to be someone local, someone who knew the back roads and where to hide a body. A few even whispered about powerful community figures, people above suspicion, with the means to cover their tracks. Police chased every lead, but none panned out. A boot print found near the shallow grave proved inconclusive. A surveillance camera at a nearby gas station showed nothing unusual. Every potential thread unraveled before it could form a knot. By the time 3 months had passed, the urgency surrounding Kaylen's case had started to fade. The sheriff's department still worked the case, but it was no longer the all-consuming priority it had once been. Resources thinned. Public pressure waned. For Kaylen's family, it was a different story. Linda Hartsfield still called the detective's office twice a week. Robert stopped teaching and began keeping a daily log of any rumors or new details he came across, hoping he'd find the one thing investigators missed. But as the summer turned to fall, hope began to shrink beneath the weight of silence. The killer had vanished, a shadow that left no shape behind. Was Kaylen's murderer a stranger, or someone hiding behind a familiar face? By 2010, Kaylen Marie Hartsfield's case had slipped from the headlines and into the quiet archive of cold files stacked deep inside the Bibb County Sheriff's Department. What had once consumed the community, the search teams, the nightly news updates, the candlelight vigils, had now become a haunting memory. New crimes demanded new attention, and detectives rotated in and out of the department. Kaylen's name was still there, pinned to the unsolved board, her photo smiling from beneath yellowing tape. But the momentum was gone. Her parents, Robert and Linda, refused to accept that silence was the end. Every April 22nd, the anniversary of the day her body was found, they hosted a candlelight vigil at the edge of Crescent Hollow Woods. Family, friends, and strangers came together, some holding signs that read "Justice for Kaylen," others simply standing in tearful silence. A single chair always sat empty in the front row, symbolizing the daughter who should have been there. Linda became the face of quiet persistence. She wrote letters to state senators, sheriffs, and local reporters pleading for someone, anyone, to reopen the investigation. Robert threw himself into community projects, trying to channel his grief into something constructive. But both parents shared the same private torment. They still didn't know who had done it, or why. For the detectives who'd worked the original case, it was a painful reminder of how even the most thorough investigations could end in nothing. The evidence had gone cold. No new witnesses had come forward. The DNA recovered back then was too degraded for analysis, and technology hadn't yet advanced far enough to make use of it. Years drifted by. Kaylen's childhood friends moved away, started families, built lives. The world around the Hartsfields changed. Smartphones, social media, new ways to stay connected. Yet for them, time stood still in 2007. The local media, once eager to cover the story, eventually stopped calling. The last major article ran in 2012, 5 years after her death. Its headline read, "Family of slain veterinary assistant still waits for answers." After that, nothing. Her name faded from the front page, replaced by newer tragedies. Then in 2015, hope flickered again. The state announced the creation of a cold case task force, a small unit dedicated to reviewing unsolved homicides across Georgia. Kaylen's case was one of the first to be reassessed. Detectives revisited the evidence boxes, soil samples, her clothing, her phone logs, and even the coroner's notes. They re-interviewed old witnesses, ran background checks on persons of interest, and sent previously unusable samples for retesting at newer labs. But once again, nothing came back. The case went dormant, again. For the Hartsfields, it was devastating but not surprising. They had learned not to expect miracles. Instead, they turned their grief into advocacy. Linda began volunteering with a victims' rights group, offering comfort to other parents who had lost children to unsolved crimes. She collected every newspaper clipping, every photo, every police update, storing them carefully in labeled binders. In one interview years later, she said softly, "I keep everything because I have to believe this story isn't finished yet. One day someone will talk, or science will catch up, and when it does, I want to be ready." For 15 years, that belief kept her going. Even as life moved on, the empty bedroom in the Hartsfield home remained untouched. Kaylen's clothes still folded, her journals stacked neatly on the dresser. It wasn't denial. It was hope, frozen in time. But as years turned to decades, the question grew heavier with every passing spring. Could science ever rewrite the past and finally name the person who took Kaylen's future away? In early 2022, hope returned, not through witness accounts or confessions, but through science. A new initiative launched by the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, GBI, in partnership with a national forensic genealogy lab, brought renewed attention to cold cases across the state. Kaylen Hartsfield's name, long dormant in dusty folders, was moved to the top of the review list. At the heart of this second wind was a single fragile artifact: Kaylen's clothing. Preserved for over 15 years in evidence storage, it had been carefully packaged by the original forensics team. Back in 2007, attempts to extract DNA from her clothing, particularly the scrubs she had been wearing when discovered, had yielded nothing viable. The technology simply wasn't there, but now it was. Using next-generation DNA recovery techniques, forensic scientists re-examined the fibers of her scrub top and waistband. This time, They discovered something faint but promising, a partial male DNA profile hidden deep within the fabric weave. It was degraded and fragmented, the result of time, exposure, and the elements, but it was enough. The profile was uploaded to GEDmatch, a public genealogy database often used by law enforcement. Unlike CODIS, which relies on direct matches to known criminals, GEDmatch allows for familial searching, looking for relatives who share parts of the DNA sequence. Within 6 weeks, there was a hit. Not a direct match, but a second cousin, a man living in Tennessee who had no known connection to the case. From there, genetic genealogists worked backward, building out an extensive family tree, searching census records, marriage licenses, and obituaries to identify branches that reached into Georgia, and that's when a name emerged: Bryce Nathaniel Cole, age 47, a former construction subcontractor who had briefly worked on a renovation project near the Greenfield Animal Clinic in the spring of 2007. His name had never appeared in the original investigation. He wasn't in Kaylen's phone, wasn't listed in any of her journals, and had never been mentioned by friends or co-workers. But when investigators dug deeper, inconsistencies surfaced. Back in 2007, Bryce had claimed to be working a job site in another town the day Kaylen disappeared. A quick check of old time cards and company records now told a different story. He had called in sick that day. He had never explained why. The GBI quietly placed him under surveillance. Weeks passed. Investigators watched his routines, where he shopped, where he worked, where he took his coffee breaks. Then, one afternoon, Bryce stopped at a local gas station and tossed a disposable coffee cup into a trash bin outside. Agents moved in and retrieved it. The lab rushed the test. Within 72 hours, the result came back, a perfect match to the partial DNA recovered from Kaylen's clothing. But science could only go so far. A match meant opportunity. It meant contact. It didn't yet prove motive. It didn't explain how or why, and it didn't confirm whether Bryce had acted alone or if someone else had helped cover it up. Investigators knew they had one shot to build a case that would hold up in court. Every move from that moment on had to be airtight. They gathered warrants, combed through Bryce's employment records, conducted background interviews with old co-workers, neighbors, even his ex-girlfriend. What they found was a man who kept to himself, but who had left subtle signs, moments that in hindsight seemed too strange to ignore. Still, questions lingered. Was Bryce truly the killer? Or just the first real piece of the puzzle? In February 2023, more than 15 years after Kaylen Hartsfield's murder, deputies from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation pulled into the driveway of a modest brick home in Putnam County, 2 counties east of Macon. There, they arrested Bryce Nathaniel Cole, a 47-year-old independent contractor. To his neighbors, Bryce was just another working man. He mowed his lawn on Saturdays, attended the occasional community potluck, and was often seen dropping off his youngest daughter at school. Married for over a decade and a father of 3, he was widely perceived as a quiet, dependable handyman, the kind of person you'd hire to fix your fence or patch up drywall. Which is exactly what made the arrest so chilling. His face was instantly familiar to many in Macon and its surrounding towns. Over the years, Bryce had worked on dozens of homes and small businesses. Some remembered him doing volunteer repairs at the local youth center. Others recalled brief, friendly exchanges with him at the hardware store. No one could reconcile the image of this soft-spoken man with the horror of Kaylen's cold case. But behind the polite exterior, investigators were discovering deep cracks in the facade. As detectives combed through his past, 2 names surfaced, 2 women who had separately filed harassment complaints against Bryce between 2006 and 2009. One woman said Bryce had followed her home from a work site and left notes on her windshield. Another reported that he'd repeatedly shown up at her place of work uninvited, refusing to leave. Neither case led to charges. Both women declined to pursue legal action at the time, citing fear of retaliation and lack of hard proof. One of those women, it turned out, had been a receptionist at a dentist's office next door to Greenfield Animal Clinic, the same strip where Kaylen had worked in 2007. In retrospect, both incidents took on a more sinister tone. Detectives brought Bryce in for questioning under the pretext of discussing construction-related inquiries. What followed was nearly 6 hours of interrogation footage that would later become central to the prosecution's case. In the early parts of the interview, Bryce was calm, polite. He maintained a relaxed posture, answered questions with short, controlled responses. But as agents began to lay out the evidence, starting with the DNA, the coffee cup, the inconsistencies in his alibi, his demeanor subtly shifted. He leaned back, crossed his arms, then began asking for clarification. When they presented him with a photo of Kaylen, young, smiling in her scrubs, something in his face changed. Not shock, not confusion, something quieter. Recognition, a flicker of it. He didn't deny knowing her. He claimed he may have seen her in passing, and that he'd worked all over town back then. But when pressed further, his answers became contradictory. He said he didn't remember being near the clinic that week, then later said he may have been by once or twice for a quote. Throughout the interrogation, he never confessed, never admitted to harming Kaylen, but his body language and the forensic evidence were painting a damning picture. Outside the station, word of the arrest spread quickly. For the Hartsfields, the moment was surreal. After years of silence, they finally had a name, a face. The man responsible for shattering their world might have been smiling politely at strangers all along. But even with Bryce in custody, the hardest question remained unanswered. Would he ever tell the truth? Or would Kaylen's final moments remain locked behind his silence forever? In November 2024, the small courthouse in Macon, Georgia, became the center of a media storm as the long-awaited trial of Bryce Nathaniel Cole began. After nearly 2 decades of questions, grief, and silence, the wheels of justice were finally turning, and the nation was watching. The courtroom was packed each day. Reporters lined the sidewalks. Locals arrived early just to secure a seat. For many, this was more than just a trial, it was a reckoning. A small-town cold case that had haunted a generation was now playing out in real time, under oath and on record. The prosecution wasted no time building their case. Led by Assistant District Attorney Carla Rhodes, the team delivered a chilling narrative. Bryce Cole had likely noticed Kaylen while working a short-term renovation project near her clinic in 2007. He'd watched her routine, learned her schedule, and on a spring evening when the opportunity aligned, he followed her, waited for the right moment, and struck with deliberate precision. Rhodes presented the DNA evidence front and center. The partial male profile recovered from Kaylen's clothing, the genetic genealogy link, the discarded coffee cup, the exact match. It was the anchor of their case. But it wasn't just science that told the story. 2 women took the stand, the same women who had once filed harassment reports against Bryce years earlier. Their voices shook as they recounted the fear they'd felt, the unwanted visits, the sense of being watched. Neither had known Kaylen, but both painted a picture of a man who could shift from charming to unsettling with little warning. One woman testified, he'd show up, smiling, acting like it was nothing. But there was always this feeling, like he was keeping score. Together, their testimonies created a pattern, one that cast doubt on the notion that Kaylen's murder had been random. The defense, however, came out swinging. Bryce's attorney argued that the DNA had been contaminated, mishandled in the lab, or possibly transferred through innocent means. He claimed the genealogy search was speculative and that the real killer was still out there. He described Bryce as a family man, a father, a victim of character assassination based on old accusations that had never been proven. But under cross-examination, the defense faltered. Bryce's lies about his whereabouts in 2007 were exposed. His shifting stories in the interrogation room were replayed for the jury. And, most importantly, the DNA evidence held firm under scrutiny. Throughout the trial, Kaylen's family sat in the front row day after day. Linda Hartsfield held a framed photo of her daughter in her lap, refusing to look away from the man accused of taking her life. Robert Hartsfield, silent but resolute, never left her side. After 3 weeks of testimony, exhibits, and arguments, the jury deliberated for just under 7 hours. When they returned, the courtroom fell into a breathless hush. Guilty, on all counts. There were no cheers, no gasps, just silence. The kind of silence that comes when justice is finally named, when truth, however painful, is finally confirmed. But as the Hartsfields embraced, tears streaming down their faces, one reality remained. Why Kaylen? Why that night? Was she the only one? Or just the only one who didn't survive? In the aftermath, those questions would linger in the minds of many. For all its forensic triumphs, this case revealed something darker: the number of harassment claims that go uninvestigated, the cases that go cold too quickly, and the predators who wear normalcy like a mask. And for every solved cold case like Kaylen's, how many others remain unheard, unsolved, and unfinished? Kaylen Marie Hartsfield is no longer a name buried inside a cold case file or a smiling photo pinned to a bulletin board in a sheriff's office. She is now a symbol of change, of justice, and of the power one voice can have even after it's been silenced. In the months following Bryce Cole's conviction, Kaylen's family launched a nonprofit called the Kaylen Project. What began as a deeply personal act of remembrance quickly grew into something larger. The organization's mission was clear: to fund advanced forensic testing for unsolved homicides and advocate for genetic genealogy access and policy reform across Georgia and beyond. Within a year, the Kaylen Project had raised enough money to help 3 neighboring counties reopen their dormant cold case files. Grants were offered for reprocessing old DNA evidence with modern technology, and partnerships were formed with genealogical labs capable of tracing leads that were once thought to be dead ends. Linda Hartsfield became the organization's figurehead. She began traveling to conferences and speaking on panels about the urgent need to bridge the gap between scientific potential and bureaucratic delays. "If we had this technology in 2007, we might have saved others," she said during a televised interview. "But now that we do, we have no excuse not to use it." In Macon, a quiet piece of land next to the Greenfield Animal Clinic was transformed into Kaylen's garden. A living memorial filled with native Georgia wildflowers, winding paths, and a shaded bench under a weeping cherry tree. A small bronze plaque rests near the entrance. It reads, "In loving memory of Kaylen Marie Hartsfield, whose love for life continues to grow here. Her favorite rescue cat, Pepper, now elderly, is often seen curled up in the grass near the bench." Staff at the clinic say he still waits near the door around closing time, like he did when Kaylen used to bring him leftovers and scratch his ears on her way home. But Kaylen's legacy isn't just rooted in symbolism. It has reshaped how local law enforcement works. Following public outcry and renewed media interest, the Bibb County Sheriff's Department adopted formal guidelines requiring all cold case evidence to be re-evaluated every 5 years, with mandatory reviews for potential DNA testing using the latest methods. Moreover, statewide legislation was introduced inspired by Kaylen's case, mandating that homicide evidence be stored indefinitely and permitting law enforcement to pursue genealogical matching in serious felony investigations. What started with one family's heartbreak sparked policy changes that could save lives. Still, for all the progress made, Linda often reminds people of the larger picture. There are still thousands of Kaylens out there. Young women, men, children, lives cut short, families waiting by the phone for decades. They deserve what we finally got: answers. And she's right. For every story like Kaylen's that ends in a trial and a guilty verdict, there are countless others still wrapped in silence, in boxes, in evidence rooms gathering dust. The difference between justice and oblivion often comes down to a single moment: a test that wasn't run, a lead that wasn't followed, a voice that refused to be quiet. Kaylen can't speak for herself anymore. But through the Kaylen Project, through policy change, and through every family given a second chance at resolution, she has become a voice for the voiceless. And as the world moves forward, one question remains painfully clear. In a world full of unsolved stories, how many more Kaylens are still waiting to be heard? For over 15 years, Kaylen Marie Hartsfield remained a haunting question mark, an unsolved name whispered in sorrow across Georgia. A gentle, vibrant young woman who vanished into silence only to be found in the woods, lifeless and voiceless. Her murder was the kind of wound a community never fully recovers from. And for her family, every year that passed without answers deepened the ache. But time didn't erase her story. It sharpened it. Through her parents' unrelenting courage, the evolution of DNA technology, and the growing force of investigative genealogy, Kaylen's voice, once stilled, was given back. The man who took her life now faces justice behind bars, exposed not by a confession, but by a trail of genetic truth he could never outrun. Georgia's 2007 cold case is now a beacon of how justice can still rise from the cold. A reminder that behind every old file is a living family waiting to heal, and that closure doesn't expire with time. Kaylen's life, though cut short, now powers a movement that's reopening doors once thought sealed. She has become more than a victim. She is a legacy, and in remembering Kaylen, we remember the thousands still waiting, the loved ones still searching, the truth still buried. If you believe every cold case deserves closure, share her story. Because justice delayed is not justice denied.